Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to our channel, AI Era Islamic Abrahamic Wisdom.
It's great to be back.
Today we have something really special. We're going to be talking about a question that feels, well, more relevant than ever. Can a set of ancient principles, a model from over 1,000 years ago, actually help us solve some of the most profound modern problems we face?
Things like wealth inequality, bureaucracy, the fight for genuine social equity. These aren't new problems, but our solutions often feel lacking.
Exactly. So today we're doing a deep dive into the governance framework of Hazrat Abu Bakr As-Siddiq, may God be pleased with him. And for this discussion, we're drawing heavily on the analysis in Zahir Ahmad Mir's book on the topic.
It's a fascinating work because it presents this history not just as a story, but as a potential blueprint for institutional duty. We're calling it the Abu Bakr model of social justice and welfare.
That's our mission today, to really get past the historical narrative and pull out a clear, systematic framework. We want to see how a welfare system was designed not as, optional mercy, but as a core, non-negotiable obligation of the state itself.
And we're going to break it down into 8 core principles. These really show how a just society can be built from the ground up, with the dignity of the individual at its absolute center.
It's a powerful idea. And before we jump in, if you find this kind of deep dive valuable, please do subscribe to our channel and like this video.
And please share it with your friends. The more people who are well informed on these topics, the better the conversation becomes for everyone.
Okay, let's get started. And I want to begin with what I think is the most radical idea in the entire model. It's about redefining the very concept of poverty.
A complete paradigm shift.
In most societies, both then and now, we tend to frame poverty as an individual issue, right? A lack of effort, maybe some bad choices, or just plain bad luck.
Right, the burden is on the individual.
But the sources we're looking at here, detailing the governance of Abu Bakr, they argue something completely different. They state that poverty was seen not as an individual failing, but as a governance failure.
And that one distinction, that single shift in perspective, is monumental. It changes everything.
How so? I mean, what does that really mean in practice?
Well, it immediately shifts the entire burden of proof. The responsibility for fixing the problem moves. If poverty is just, an unfortunate but inevitable part of life, then the state's role is optional charity, a kind gesture.
A handout, basically.
Exactly. But if you define poverty as a governance failure, it means the system is broken. The structures the state has put in place are fundamentally deficient, and the responsibility lands squarely on the institution, not on the shoulders of the person who is suffering.
So the state's role completely changes. It's no longer a benevolent provider of discretionary aid.
It becomes an obligatory guarantor of basic needs. Welfare moves from being a simple act of kindness, what you might call ihsan, to being an absolute, non-negotiable duty, a fard. It's baked into the very reason for the state's existence.
Wow. Just think about the implications of that for a modern government.
It's huge. If a state today truly adopted that principle, then suddenly metrics like GDP growth, they become secondary.
Secondary to what?
To things like housing security, food stability, access to education. Because if those metrics are failing, it means the government itself is failing its most fundamental mandate.
That would completely reframe every single budget debate. I mean, if getting rid of poverty is the benchmark for success, all other spending has to be justified against that.
Absolutely. How can a government ethically proceed with, say, a massive infrastructure project or increased defense spending if it hasn't first fulfilled its structural duty to make sure its own citizens have food and shelter?
The moral and political imperative just takes over. The state is, by definition, structurally deficient if its people are suffering.
Precisely. And it all ties back to this core goal of maintaining the basic dignity of every single citizen. The term used is izzat-i-nafs.
Izzat-i-nafs. That's such a powerful phrase. It's not just about survival, is it? Break that down for us.
It's about self-respect, dignity. The sources make it clear that if the state fails to provide the basics, food, security, a roof over your head, it is actively stripping an individual of their dignity.
So the state has this direct, proactive responsibility to make sure people can live without the shame that comes with destitution.
Yes, and practically that means 2 things. First, the aid has to be enough to actually meet the need, no half measures. And second, the way it's delivered, the mechanisms themselves, have to be respectful and efficient.
So you're talking about avoiding the soul-crushing bureaucracy we see today, the endless forms, the humiliating interviews, the processes that seem designed to make you give up rather than to actually help you?
You've hit the nail on the head. When welfare is an institutional duty, the state isn't doing you a favor, it's fulfilling a core obligation. So the process has to be streamlined, it has to be respectful, it can't have unnecessary delays.
Because if the process itself degrades the dignity of the person receiving help,
Then the entire system has failed the principle of izatanafs, no matter how much money actually gets transferred.
okay, so we've established the duty, it's a state obligation, but how is this universal duty actually financed? That brings us straight to the engine of the whole system, Zakat.
Right. And we need to unpack this carefully because in this model, zakat is so much more than a simple religious levy or a tax. It's a powerful economic force.
It's completely transformed, really. It moves beyond being a personal, private act of worship.
It becomes the essential financial instrument for the survival of the entire social structure. The term for this is muasharati tawazun, the social balance. And that balance has to be actively maintained with financial tools.
So let's get into the mechanics. What were the core systemic functions of zakat that made it more than just a tax? What was its economic purpose?
There were three primary functions, and they were all seen as vital for the health of both the economy and the society. The first, and this is probably the most revolutionary part from an economic standpoint, is that zakat actively prevents the concentration of wealth.
Dolat ko markuz hanay sirraktiye. It stops wealth from becoming centralized.
Exactly.
Okay, let's drill down on that. How does an annual levy of, say, 2.5% on surplus wealth actually stop the creation of permanent economic dynasties over time?
It acts as a built-in automatic economic stabilizer. It fights against long-term wealth disparity. Think about it. If a wealthy person simply hoards their assets, gold, cash, anything not being used productively, that 2.5% levy is constantly, year after year, eroding the value of that stagnant wealth.
So it creates a powerful incentive.
A very powerful one. You have two choices. Either you invest that wealth productively, which creates jobs and economic activity, or you let the system cyclically redistribute a portion of it through zakat.
Over generations, that would make it almost impossible for a single family to just sit on a massive fortune without it either being put to work or slowly redistributed.
Precisely. It makes the formation of permanent, untouchable, consolidated fortunes incredibly difficult. So it's not just a revenue stream for the state. It's a dynamic, anti-hoarding and anti-monopoly mechanism built right into the economic foundation.
That's fascinating. What's the second function?
The second is that it's the dedicated, earmarked funding for public welfare. This ensures a constant, reliable flow of resources specifically to protect the vulnerable. And crucially, these funds can't be diverted to other projects. They're sacrosanct.
And the third?
The third is that by doing those first two things, it sustains that fundamental social balance we talked about, a cohesive society where the strong support the weak. This ensures stability, and it prevents the kind of deep-seated resentment that can tear a society apart.
This is where it gets really interesting, especially given the history. The sources talk about their response to people refusing to pay zakat. It wasn't just treated like tax evasion.
Not at all. It was seen as a threat to the entire social system, nizam se inkar, a rejection of the system itself.
That's a profound political and legal justification. Why was it framed in such severe terms?
It was controversial, even at the time. But the justification ties directly back to that first principle we discussed. The state has a structural duty to eradicate poverty.
And it can't fulfill that duty without the resources.
Exactly. That duty is entirely conditional on having access to the dedicated pool of zakat funds. So if influential people withhold those funds, they are actively sabotaging the state's ability to fulfill its sworn duty of care to the poorest citizens.
So the argument wasn't just about revenue. It was about defending the nizam, the very integrity of the welfare system.
Precisely. Refusing to pay zakat wasn't just shortchanging the treasury. It was structurally disabling the protections designed for the weakest members of society. It was like an act of aggression against the social contract.
You're essentially saying, I refuse to participate in the mechanism that guarantees dignity for my fellow citizen.
And that provided the moral and legal justification for enforcement. Because the entire welfare protection system was under threat. The state wasn't just collecting taxes, it was defending its structural responsibility to the weak.
So the funds are collected with this incredible level of commitment. The next big test for any state, then, is distribution. How do you allocate resources without letting biased political, tribal, personal creep in?
This is the ultimate test of justice, isn't it? A system can be perfectly funded, but if the distribution is corrupt, the entire thing collapses. The sources make it clear that the distribution mechanism was designed to be rigorously neutral.
How so? It seems like they actively tried to avoid the most common traps of corruption and patronage.
They did. They specifically built firewalls against three major pitfalls that are common in almost any political system, especially ones that were built on tribal or feudal ties back then.
Okay, let's break down those three traps. This is the core of the anti-corruption mechanism. What's the first one?
The first trap they avoided was no tribal preference. Kabila nahi dekha gaya.
That's radical for that time and place.
Absolutely. In a new society where your tribe was basically your social security system, to suddenly say that need, not lineage, is the only thing that matters. That institutionalizes a concept of universal citizenship overnight.
So a poor person from a rival tribe had the exact same right to state help as a poor person from the caliph's own tribe.
The exact same right. It's a massive statement about creating a society based on shared humanity, not inherited power. A huge step away from the political norms of the era.
Incredible. What about the second trap?
The second was no political favoritism or influence. Asar Rasuk Nahi Dekagaya. This meant aid could not be used as a political weapon.
So a ruler couldn't give more aid to a region just to secure their loyalty.
Or withhold it to punish a political opponent. This firewall completely separates welfare from political power plays. It ensures that assistance remains a fundamental right, totally independent of your political leanings.
And the third trap. This is one that feels especially relevant today, what we call elite capture.
Right. Subsidizing the powerful under the guise of stimulating the economy.
Did they have a defense against that?
They did. The third principle was no elite capture or preference for power. Tak kotarje nahimili. Welfare funds were strictly and only for the poor and vulnerable. They were not diverted to subsidize wealthy merchants or influential families. The entire focus was squarely on the marginalized.
That's a crucial defense mechanism against structural inequality.
It is. So justice was defined purely as fair access based on verifiable need. It was completely divorced from social standing, tribal identity, or political influence.
So who specifically received this aid? Was it just a kind of universal basic income, or was it more targeted?
No, it was very targeted. The sources list specific categories that show how thoughtful the aid was. It included the poor, of course, but also widows and orphans, people who had lost their primary support system.
Okay, that makes sense.
It also specifically included the disabled, those who couldn't work, and very importantly, it targeted those who were genuinely burdened by debt.
That focus on debt is incredibly insightful.
It is, because it recognizes that economic distress isn't always a chronic condition. Sometimes it's acute, caused by a crisis sickness, a bad harvest, a war. And that requires a systemic intervention to stop a temporary crisis from becoming lifelong, multi-generational poverty.
By clearing that debilitating debt, the state is basically restoring a person's economic agency.
Exactly. You bring them back to solvency. You allow them to contribute to the economy again instead of becoming a permanent dependent. It's structural support designed for immediate rehabilitation, not just passive maintenance.
Let's shift gears a bit now and talk about the management of all these public funds, the Beit ul-Mal, the public treasury. In so many empires, the national treasury basically becomes the ruler's personal piggy bank.
Right. Used for lavish projects, personal enrichment, you name it. This model completely flips that concept on its head.
How so?
It fundamentally establishes the concept of a public trust, fiduciary responsibility. The philosophy was simple but revolutionary. The Beit ul-Mal existed to serve the people, not the rulers. Hukmrano kaliya nahi awam kaliyeta.
That creates an immediate, unreachable wall between state funds and personal gain for those in power.
It does. It elevates the administrator from being an owner of the resources to being a mere custodian, a steward.
But if the treasury belongs to the people, that puts some very strict operational requirements on its administration. How did they make sure the custodians actually followed that philosophy? What were the rules for managing this public money?
The sources point to three non-negotiable requirements, and they're still radical by today's standards. First, transparent allocation.
So no secret budgets.
None. Public funds cannot be managed in secret. Accountability demands absolute clarity on where the money comes from and, more importantly, where it goes. This transparency allows for immediate public scrutiny, which is the natural enemy of corruption.
Makes sense. Transparency is always the first step toward integrity. What was the second requirement?
Second, the distribution had to be needs-based. Sharif, Munsifana, or Zarat par Mabni Taksim. This just reinforces the principle we talked about earlier. Fairness is defined by need, not by favor.
Yes.
But wait, doesn't a needs-based system require some discretionary judgment from the administrator? How do you stop that from opening the door to bias all over again?
That's a great question, and it's a critical challenge. The check against that bias came from the third and most important requirement: zero personal benefit for the administration or the ruler.
Zero.
The use of the public treasury for any private gain was strictly forbidden. And the ultimate example of this in practice was Abu Bakr's own conduct. He took a small stipend from the Baitul Mal, but only because he had to give up his work as a merchant when he took office.
And I've read that he even reduced that stipend.
He did. When he realized it was a bit more than he needed, he reduced it to ensure his standard of living was actually slightly below that of the average citizen.
That sets a profound precedent. The highest office in the land is a path to sacrifice, not wealth.
It reinforces the idea that public office is a service, not a vehicle for wealth accumulation. And the core principle tying all this together is that public money must continuously return to the public. It shouldn't stagnate in the treasury or be diverted. The efficiency of the Baitul Mal was judged by how quickly and effectively it was circulated back to the needy.
This all sounds like a fantastic system for immediate relief, but any modern debate about welfare always comes back to one word: sustainability. How do you prevent generosity from creating structural dependency over time?
That's where the integrated design of the model really shines. The sources are clear that this policy wasn't just about handing out money. It was about achieving long-term societal health and self-reliance.
So it had to combine multiple elements at once.
Exactly. Three things were happening simultaneously. First, you needed immediate relief, fari medad, to stop the bleeding, to stop suffering right now.
Okay, that's the emergency response.
Second, you needed to build long-term stability. Tavel mudati istekam. This is about building resilience into the community structure itself. And third, you had to incorporate moral responsibility, akhlaqi zimmedari.
What does that mean, moral responsibility?
It means the state understood its role was to foster a community that valued contribution and self-reliance, but a community that was also supported by strong structural protections. It was a holistic intervention.
So you're treating the symptom while simultaneously trying to fix the root cause.
And ensuring the whole environment is conducive to self-reliance. The strategic goal of the entire system was explicitly to remove dependency, not to create a permanent dependent class. Masad, in his art Khatam Karna.
Because if welfare is just a permanent, passive transfer of cash?
It risks eroding human agency, motivation, dignity. So the aid provided often wasn't just cash, it was capital. It might be lending someone the tools they need for their trade, providing seed money for a small business, or covering a crippling debt so they can get back on their feet.
So even the design of the aid itself was targeted toward empowerment and self-sufficiency.
Yes. The goal was to ensure the recipient had a realistic path to eventually exit the system because their own capacity had been restored. The ultimate measure of success for this model isn't how many people are receiving aid.
It's how quickly those who need temporary support are able to transition back to productive economic life.
Exactly. It's a safety net designed to bounce people back up, not a hammock that lets them sink into complacency. The system is permanent, but an individual's reliance on it should ideally be temporary.
Let's talk about the people who actually run this system, the administrators. They are the gatekeepers of public trust and dignity. The system demands unwavering integrity from them.
It has to. Accountability was absolutely non-negotiable. The oversight of welfare officials was incredibly stringent because they recognized that corruption at this level directly steals from the poor.
What did that oversight actually look like day to day?
Well, for starters, they were constantly monitored. Their actions, their personal standard of living, any wealth they accumulated, and their delivery methods were all under continuous scrutiny.
Scrutiny from who?
From appointed auditors and also through direct public feedback channels. They were also explicitly removable. If they failed to meet the ethical or administrative standards, they could be dismissed immediately. And most importantly, they were directly answerable. Jawab day.
Meaning a citizen could actually demand an explanation for a decision?
Yes. Accountability was institutionalized. There were clear channels where anyone could challenge a decision or report a discrepancy. There are historical accounts of Abu Bakr himself conducting audits on his officials and demanding the immediate return of state assets if even the slightest misuse was found.
So the message from the top was unambiguous.
Completely. Competence and personal integrity were inseparable requirements for the job.
And what if an official failed? What were the consequences for misusing aid?
It wasn't treated as a minor administrative error. It was explicitly framed as a betrayal of trust. Imanat mein khianat jurm thi, a crime.
That moral framing is so important.
It is. Because the money was understood to belong to the poor, stealing it was seen as theft from the most defenseless members of society. That made the crime far more egregious than, say, standard fraud against the general treasury. Integrity wasn't a suggestion. It was a job requirement enforced by immediate and severe consequences.
Now we have to take this ancient, integrity-focused model and bring it right into our world today. An era of algorithms, digital IDs, big data, and AI. How do these principles even apply to modern digital economies?
You know, the foundational ethics, the core demands, they remain timeless, even if the tools are completely different. The model places very specific, non-negotiable demands on how we design and implement our digital welfare systems.
Because technology can be a force multiplier for efficiency.
But it can also be a force multiplier for injustice and systemic bias if we're not incredibly careful.
So what's the first demand this model would place on a system that uses algorithms to target aid?
The first would be the need for ethical data use. Akhlaqi data istimal. Yes, we need data to target aid effectively and prevent fraud. But the data we collect and how we use it has to strictly adhere to that core principle of non-bias.
Which means we have to audit the algorithms themselves.
We have to. If an algorithm is trained on biased historical data, it's just going to perpetuate and even amplify those same biases. If it implicitly favors certain demographics or excludes marginalized groups, say people without a formal credit history or those who live in remote areas, then it's violating the original principle.
So the ancient demand for non-bias becomes a modern demand for algorithmic fairness. We have to make sure the code doesn't inherit the prejudices of the past.
Exactly. And the system must also guarantee fair access to digital welfare. Digital fala tak barabarase.
You're talking about the digital divide.
I am. If a welfare system moves entirely online, as many are doing, it creates a new barrier. It automatically excludes those who don't have internet access, or a smartphone, or just the digital skills to navigate a complex application process.
So digital exclusion becomes the new form of exclusion by influence. It hits the elderly, the remote, and the poorest the hardest.
It does, which means the state has an obligation to invest not just in the welfare check itself, but in public digital infrastructure and literacy programs to make sure everyone has access. You can't use digital efficiency as an excuse to abandon your duty of universal access.
What about corruption? In the digital age, it looks different. It's not just cash in an envelope.
That's right. Digital corruption can be data manipulation, identity theft of recipients, or leaking sensitive data for political gain. That principle of a betrayal of trust has to apply just as severely to someone who misuses a digital key as it did to an official who stole from the physical treasury.
One last thing on this. That rule of a zero personal benefit. How does that apply when governments increasingly outsource the design and management of these huge, complex digital systems to private for-profit contractors?
That is a critical modern ethical challenge. The spirit of that rule demands that the profit motive must always be strictly secondary to the public duty of delivering welfare with dignity.
So the state needs to rigorously audit those contractors.
Rigorously, to make sure their profit model doesn't compromise the neutrality or the accessibility of the aid. If a contractor profits from, say, high application rejection rates or bureaucratic complexity, that fundamentally violates the entire spirit of this model.
It all comes back to this idea of dignity-centered policy design. Insani wakrat ka markaz banana.
Yes. And this is probably the biggest challenge of the digital era. The sources give us a crucial warning here. AI must support welfare, but it must not replace compassion. AI hamdardi ka naimul badal nahi.
So technology can handle the calculations, the fraud detection, the swift transfers.
But human intervention, empathy, the ability to handle exceptions with dignity, that cannot be automated away. Because if the system is too rigid, if the computer says no based on some arbitrary data point that doesn't capture the full complexity of a human life,
then that rigidity strips the person of their dignity and their voice. It just creates a new, colder form of bureaucracy.
Precisely. The goal of the original model was to see the person and their need. If our digital systems become so impersonal that they dehumanize the recipient, they have structurally failed the mandate of Izzat-e-Nafs, no matter how efficient they are on paper.
We have covered so much ground today. We started with this radical idea that welfare is a structural duty, not charity. We saw how Zakat functions as an economic system for social balance, And we've explored the non-negotiable standards of accountability that are needed to make it all work, even in our own digital age.
For me, what stands out the most is that consistent focus on the most vulnerable as the true metric of a society's success. The entire structure, from collection to distribution to accountability, was built to shield the marginalized.
And that really leads us to the fundamental governing principle of this entire model. It's a timeless measure for any state in any era.
Right. The sources distill it all down to this one powerful, actionable statement. A society or a state is judged not by its wealth, but by how it treats its weakest members. Riyasat azmat kamzor ki hifazat se napi jati hai.
The true measure of its greatness is the protection it gives to those who have the least power.
That's a profound lens to view any policy decision through. It just inverts our typical priorities. If a state is prosperous, but poverty is still widespread, can we really say that state is succeeding? According to this model, the answer is a clear and simple no.
So we'll leave you, our listeners, with this final provocative thought for your own deep dive. If a modern government began to view poverty explicitly and universally as a governance failure, as an institutional lack of success, how drastically would that immediately change the priorities of every single government budget?
And what immediate tangible actions would be required right now to fulfill that newly acknowledged duty instead of just waiting for the next budget cycle?
Think about how that one redefinition would reorient our debates on everything from housing policy to minimum wage to digital access.
That's the question we leave you with.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the structural foundations of social justice. Until next time, keep exploring and stay well informed.